man in the chair wasn't Gary Cooper. He had Cooper's height, Cooper's build, Cooper's hairline, but nobody on that set knew his name. For 10 years, he'd stood in the exact spots where Cooper would stand, absorbing the heat of the lights while technicians adjusted their equipment, then stepping aside the moment the real star arrived. And on March 14, 1956, that invisible man was about to appear on camera for the first time in a decade, though he wouldn't understand why until someone told him the truth 14 years later. The job was called stand-in. Every major star had one. The work was simple. Arrive early, wear clothes that match the star's costume, position yourself where the star would be positioned, and hold still while the lighting crew spent hours perfecting their setups. When everything was ready, you stepped out of the frame, the star stepped in, and the cameras rolled on someone else. No glory, no screen time, no credits, just the knowledge that your body had helped shape the light that made someone else look like a god. Harold Vance had been Gary Cooper's stand-in since 1946. Same height, 6'3", same lean build, same way of holding his shoulders. From a distance, from behind, in silhouette, they could have been twins. Up close, of course, the differences were obvious. Vance's face was rounder, his features softer, his eyes a different shade entirely. But up close didn't matter. Stand-ins were never seen up close. Stand-ins were never seen at all. That was the deal. That was the job. Harold had made peace with it years ago. What he hadn't made peace with was the letter in his pocket, the one he'd received 3 days ago from a hospital in Pasadena. His wife Eleanor was sick, had been sick for months, though they'd hidden it from everyone, hoping it would resolve itself, hoping the doctors were wrong. The doctors weren't wrong. The diagnosis was confirmed. Treatment was possible, but expensive, more expensive than a stand-in's salary could cover, more expensive than their savings, their house, everything they'd built in 23 years of marriage. Harold hadn't told anyone on set. He showed up, did his job, stood in his spots, absorbed his light, stepped aside when Cooper arrived. The work didn't stop because your life was falling apart. The work never stopped. But Gary Cooper noticed anyway. Here's what Cooper saw on the morning of March 14th that made him ask questions he'd never asked before. Harold was in position for the first setup of the day, a dialogue scene in a ranch house interior. Cooper's character confronting a corrupt banker. The lighting required 45 minutes of adjustment, which meant 45 minutes of Harold standing motionless in the key light while grips repositioned reflectors and the cinematographer checked his meters. Cooper usually spent this time in his trailer, reviewing pages, conserving energy for the performance ahead. But today, he'd come to set early. Insomnia, restlessness, the vague dissatisfaction that had been following him lately. He stood in the shadows near the camera, watching the setup unfold. And he watched Harold. The man was standing perfectly still, as always. Professionals didn't fidget, didn't shift, didn't make the lighting crew's job harder than it needed to be. But something was different. Harold's hands, usually relaxed at his sides, were clenched. His jaw, usually slack, was tight. His eyes, usually unfocused in the middle distance, kept darting toward his jacket hanging on a chair nearby, toward the pocket where something was folded. Cooper had spent 30 years reading faces for a living. He knew what worry looked like. He knew what fear looked like. And he knew what desperation looked like when a man was trying to hide it. "That's Harold Vance, right?" Cooper asked the assistant director. "My stand-in." "Has been for 10 years. Reliable as sunrise." "What do you know about him?" The AD shrugged. "Shows up on time. Doesn't complain. Same height as you." He paused. "Why?" "Just curious." But Cooper wasn't just curious. He was calculating. The film they were shooting was called The Divided Sky, a prestige Western with a budget that allowed for things smaller pictures couldn't afford. Union crew, full benefits, health insurance for anyone classified as a performer rather than a technician. Stand-ins weren't classified as performers. They were technicians, crew members who worked with their bodies but never appeared on camera. The distinction seemed arbitrary, but the consequences were real. Performers got SAG membership, health insurance, pension contributions. Technicians got a day rate and a handshake. Harold Vance had been doing this work for 10 years and had never qualified for a single benefit that performers received automatically. Cooper started asking questions, quietly, to people who would know and wouldn't talk. The unit production manager told him about Harold's wife. Sick. Treatment needed. Insurance non-existent. Harold had apparently asked about borrowing against his future wages, a request that had been denied. The wardrobe supervisor told him about the jacket Harold wore every day. Same jacket for 4 years. Never replaced. Stand-in wages didn't leave much room for extras. A grip who'd known Harold since the beginning told him about the man's history. 20 years of background work before becoming a stand-in. Hundreds of productions, never once appearing on camera. Invisible career for an invisible man, the grip said. But steady. You could set your watch by Harold Vance. Cooper absorbed all of it, and then he found the gap. Listen carefully, because this is where the rules bent without breaking. Screen Actors Guild membership, the golden ticket that separated performers from technicians, required one thing above all others: verifiable on-camera appearance in a union production. Didn't matter how brief. Didn't matter if your face was visible. If you appeared on camera in footage that was used in the final cut, you could apply for membership. And membership meant insurance. Insurance meant Eleanor Vance could get treatment. The problem was, stand-ins never appeared on camera. That was the whole point. They held positions until the real performers arrived, then disappeared. Unless someone made a mistake. Unless a director kept a shot that accidentally included a stand-in in the background. Unless the footage was good enough that cutting around the error would cost more than it was worth. Cooper found the cinematographer during lunch break. "Ed, I need to ask you something. Hypothetically." Ed Morrison had shot 14 pictures with Cooper over the years. He knew when hypothetically meant actually. "Go ahead." "The ranch house scene this afternoon. The wide shot when I crossed to the window. If someone were standing in the background, way in the background, edge of frame, would that ruin the shot? Depends on who and where. If they're dressed right and not moving, probably wouldn't even notice. Why? Just thinking about composition." Cooper paused. "What if it was Harold, my stand-in, in costume, in the background, very still?" Ed studied Cooper's face. He'd worked in this business long enough to recognize when something was happening beneath the surface of a conversation. You want Harold in the shot. I want Harold to have been in the shot, by accident, an oversight nobody caught until the footage was already printed. "Coop, that's—" Ed stopped. Thought about it. "That's actually not complicated. Wide lens, deep focus. He'd be small but visible. If Weiler asks, we say we didn't notice until post." "Would it qualify him for a SAG? On-camera appearance in a union production?" "Yeah, that's the threshold." "Then let's not notice until post." The scene was scheduled for 3 p.m. Cooper spent the 2 hours before it having a conversation with Harold Vance that would later be described, by those who overheard fragments of it, as unusual. He found Harold in the stand-in's usual spot, a folding chair near the equipment trucks, away from the main activity, invisible as always. Cooper sat down next to him like they were old friends, though they'd barely exchanged more than professional courtesies in 10 years. "Harold, I need you to do something for me this afternoon." Harold looked up, startled. Stars didn't make requests of stand-ins. Stars barely acknowledged stand-ins existed. Of course, Mr. Cooper, whatever you need. The ranch house scene. Wide shot. When I cross to the window, I want you in the background. Standing near the bookshelf, very still. You'll be in costume anyway from the setup. Just don't change. Stay dressed. Stay in position. Sir, I'm not sure I understand. Stand-ins clear the set before cameras roll. That's usually what happens. Today, you stay. You stand very still near the bookshelf. You don't look at the camera. You don't move. You're just there. Background, part of the furniture. Harold's confusion was visible. Mr. Cooper, if I appear on camera, that's a whole different classification. The production office would have to reclassify me as a performer. The paperwork alone. The paperwork will sort itself out after the fact. What matters is that you're in that shot, on camera, in footage that gets used. Why? Cooper looked at him for a long moment. Direct. No pretense. Because you've been doing this work for 10 years, and you've got nothing to show for it, except a day rate and a jacket you've worn since '52. Because your wife needs treatment that stand-in wages can't pay for, and because the only thing standing between her getting that treatment and not getting it is a classification system that could be solved by you standing near a bookshelf for 30 seconds. Harold's face went through several expressions: shock, confusion, something that might have been the beginning of protest. How did you know about Eleanor? I asked. Nobody on this set is as invisible as they think they are. Cooper stood up. 3 o'clock. Bookshelf. Stay very still. He walked away before Harold could respond. The shot happened at 3:47 p.m. Cooper crossed the ranch house set, delivered his dialogue to the corrupt banker, moved toward the window as blocked. In the background, barely visible at the edge of frame, a figure stood motionless near the bookshelf, dressed in period costume, face partially obscured, but undeniably present. Director William Wyler watched the playback on the monitor, frowned. There's someone in the background, near the bookshelf. Is that? That's Harold Vance, Cooper said. My stand-in. We must have forgotten to clear him. We need to shoot it again. We're losing the light, Bill. The next setup takes an hour and sunsets in 90 minutes. What we have works. Harold's small in the frame. Nobody's going to notice. Wyler looked at the monitor again, looked at the fading light. Outside, looked at his watch. It's a good take otherwise. Performance is there. The light's perfect, he sighed. Fine. We'll work around it in post if we have to. Moving on. The footage was printed. The scene was cut into the final film, and Harold Vance appeared on camera in a union production for the first time in his career. The paperwork took 3 weeks to process. The production office, faced with footage that clearly showed a stand-in in a finished shot, had no choice but to reclassify him retroactively as a day player, an on-camera performer entitled to all the benefits that classification carried. SAG membership followed. Health insurance followed that. By the time the production wrapped, Eleanor Vance was enrolled in a treatment program that her husband's newly acquired benefits covered entirely. Harold never questioned how it happened. The official explanation, an oversight, a forgotten stand-in, a shot that was too good to waste, made enough sense that he didn't look deeper. He was too busy being grateful, too busy taking Eleanor to her appointments, too busy adjusting to the strange new reality of being a person the system recognized. The truth emerged 14 years later in 1970 from an unexpected source. Ed Morrison, the cinematographer, was giving a lecture at UCLA on the technical aspects of classic Western photography. A student asked about happy accidents, shots that worked despite things going wrong. Ed told the story of the divided sky, the stand-in the background, the decision to keep the footage, the star who had quietly engineered the whole thing so that an invisible man could become visible long enough to save his wife's life. "Wait," the student said. "Gary Cooper did that deliberately? It wasn't an accident?" "Not even close. Cooper set up every piece of it, talked to me beforehand, made sure I knew where to put Harold in the frame, coached the director into keeping the shot. The whole oversight was about as accidental as a Swiss watch. Did the stand-in ever find out? Not from me, not from Cooper. He died in '61, never told anyone as far as I know. I don't know if Harold Vance knows to this day." The student who asked that question wrote a letter to Harold Vance 2 weeks later, introduced himself, explained what he'd learned, asked if Harold had ever suspected the truth. Harold's response arrived a month after that, handwritten on plain paper, the penmanship of a man who'd learned to write before typewriters were common. "I never suspected," he wrote. "For 14 years, I believed I got lucky. I believed the universe made a mistake in my favor for once, and I was too grateful to question it. Now I know it wasn't luck. It wasn't the universe. It was a man who noticed that I was struggling, figured out what I needed, and found a way to give it to me without making me feel like a charity case." Eleanor passed in '68, but she had 12 good years after her diagnosis. 12 years of treatment. 12 years of time we wouldn't have had without that insurance. 12 years because Gary Cooper decided that a stand-in's wife deserved to live. I wish I'd known while he was alive. I wish I could have thanked him. But maybe that's the point. Maybe he didn't want to be thanked. Maybe he just wanted Eleanor to have those 12 years, and he didn't need anything else. That's a kind of generosity I didn't know existed. The kind that doesn't need to be seen. The kind that does the work and walks away. I've been visible now for 14 years, SAG member, real benefits, the whole package. But I've never forgotten what it felt like to be invisible. And I've never stopped being grateful to the man who saw me when no one else did. Harold Vance continued working in the film industry until 1978. He never became a star, never even became a recognizable face, but he was a member of the Screen Actors Guild for 22 years, with full benefits, full pension, full participation in an industry that had ignored him for the first half of his career. When he gave interviews in his later years, small publications, film history projects, the occasional documentary, he always mentioned the divided sky. Always mentioned the accident that changed everything. After 1970, he knew it wasn't an accident, but he kept telling the story the old way, the way that made it sound like luck, because that's how Cooper had wanted it told, because the gift had come without strings, and Harold wasn't going to add any after the fact. The final shot of the divided sky is unremarkable, just a wide shot of a ranch house interior, a conversation between powerful men. If you watch carefully, you can see a figure standing near the bookshelf in the background, small, still, easy to miss if you're not looking. That's Harold Vance. That's a man becoming visible for the first time in his career. That's 30 seconds of footage that meant 12 years of life for a woman. Named Eleanor. The credits list Gary Cooper above the title. They don't list Harold Vance at all. Stand-ins never appeared in credits, even after they'd been reclassified. But the footage exists. The proof is in the frame, and everyone who knows where to look can find the moment when an invisible man stepped into the light. Some appearances change everything. Some visibility lasts only 30 seconds. And some gifts are given so quietly that it takes 14 years to understand what they were. If you enjoyed spending this time here, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. A simple like also helps more than you'd think. This is a dramatized story inspired by real people and events. Specific dialogue, scenes, and side characters are creative reconstruction for storytelling purposes.